Well, thought I'd just do a quick video to answer a few questions about this car, this Series 2 1996 VS Commodore. And the first question is, what type of gearbox does this thing run? And well, the short answer is it's a modified, I'm not sure in what way, 4L60E. Now this is a 4L60E without the removable bell housing. Yeah, so it is definitely a 4L60E. I've done a lot of research and that's what they ran in VRVS series. The earlier transmission was, you know, hydraulic, mechanical, it wasn't electronic, so that's the difference. E for electronic. You can buy parts for these on eBay pretty readily, like the high energy frictions, the high energy bands and stuff, and also the shift kits from Transgo, which is a pretty good brand from what I've read and understand. You can also buy the Beast reaction shell, which is, you should replace the reaction shell every time you rebuild one of these autos. But okay, that's the first question. The second question is, why a rebuild and why not just do a VRS set? Well, the short answer is, to answer this question, we'll go to the other registered Commodore, because this thing allegedly has a head gasket problem, but I don't think it does. But it still needs a rebuild, even though it runs well, even though it doesn't really leak oil. But let's go to the other car and let's actually have a look at why I want to rebuild the engine in the dark green one. Well, this has been a really dependable car. Like, it looks pretty average, but it's just been so reliable. Like, honestly, it's got basically about 360,000 Ks on the clock. It's had the piss flogged out of it by me. It's had the piss flogged out of it by the horse float towing lady that owned it before I did. So it's had a hard life. Probably hasn't been serviced as much as it should have been. Like, I know it's well overdue for a service, and I've got all the stuff to do that. That's going to be another, you know, video. Not a how-to, but just anything I find that's even slightly interesting. But the reason why I want to do a rebuild on the other car's engine is simply because it's a nuisance having a car with an engine that hasn't already been rebuilt if it's old. I mean, we get away with it with this thing, this ED, because the damn thing's perfect. The seals and gaskets all seal and they're all in really good nick. I'm not saying for a second that this ED won't need a head gasket, because it probably will one day. It's the original head gasket, it runs extremely well, but, you know, you'd buy head bolts and a gasket and whatever, and you'd expect to need it one day. You can use a multi-layered stainless gasket, but the block and the head have to be absolutely perfect. So forget running multi-layer stainless gaskets in any car that hasn't just had the deck machined and the head machined. And the surface finish has to be, and they give you a number in RA or RA, it's surface finish number or roughness, and it has to be below a certain RA number, and it's a really carefully machined surface. So if you're going to get the block and head machine for a multi-layer stainless gasket, tell your machinist that's what you're putting in it, because that might be something that's worth knowing for them, just because of how good the surface has to be. But back to this car, one of the things about this engine is it doesn't leak puddles of oil anywhere, but it does leak oil. It's not leaking it badly, but you can see that I accidentally spilt oil when I filled it, but you can see that, like, around this manifold it's wet, and I don't know why. The rocker covers are leaking because the plastic's cracked, I think, but it could also be, you know, the actual manifold gasket. I'm not really sure. No, it's not leaking vacuum, but yeah, it's a bit sad. So by the time 10,000 kilometres rolls around, this thing's almost got no oil left in it. Like, it's just at the end of the dipstick. So that's part of the reason why, if your car's more than 10 years old, I strongly suggest 5,000 to 7,000 kilometres being the service interval you should be changing your oil at minimum, because if you don't check your oil regularly, it's going to have nothing left by the time you get to that service interval. 6 months or 10,000 Ks is just too much for an old car. I mean, let's face it, this thing, it's going to burn oil. The stem seals are worn out, and you never see it blowing smoke, and the vacuum isn't low, so the piston rings are half reasonable in it, but it does burn oil because the valve guides are slightly enlarged clearance between the stem of the valve and the guide. It has to be. It's done nearly 400,000 Ks, so it's not like it's a new car anymore. The valve stem seals themselves, the rubber goes hard and they stop sealing properly. So you're going to do cat converters, and this cat converter works but not properly. I know that already. When it's cold, it's normal for cats to not do their job as well as they do when they're hot, but you can tell the difference just even the smell of the exhaust. It shouldn't be like an old car exhaust smell if the cat's doing its job. If it runs for like 3 minutes, it should get enough heat into that cat to start doing something, and this thing doesn't. It just sort of takes maybe 10 minutes before it does anything. Someone's going to say that's normal, but you know, remember the catalytic converter on this, it's very close to where the motor is. It's not far away. So really, to do all the seals and gaskets in an engine, including Welsh plugs, it requires removal of the engine. So we've removed the engine, we've pulled the heads, because if you're going to do manifold gasket, you might as well pull the heads off, because a lot of the time the VRS set with the head gaskets is cheaper than buying the inlet manifold gasket separately and all that. So also these plenums are like a 3-piece. These runners are separate to this bit here, and the top bolts on, as you can see, and the gaskets and seals, they stop working properly. I clean this regularly enough that you can't see it, but you can see around here it looks oily, and that's because this seal is not working as well as it could, and that can't be sealed using Celastic. It's a rubber seal that has to be replaced, and that's all included in a VRS set, including the gasket between the throttle body and the plenum chamber, which you should change as well. You'd be surprised how well even a worn out engine can run if it doesn't leak vacuum. So the long and short of this long ramble is that pretty much to do all the stuff that needs to be done to make it seal oil and coolant, it leaks coolant. You can see that, well, maybe you can't, but you can see around here, this is the heater return. It goes down to the tap arrangement, but you can see it looks a bit white and corroded, and that's because that O-ring in there leaks. Now this other pipe here, which also leaks because the hose clamps, you know, it's loose. It's also not a very good hose clamp. The hose clamp's as tight as it will go. It's just buggered because it's a shit hose clamp. But this stainless steel pipe goes under this gear here, and it goes into the manifold where the thermostat housing is. You're not going to see it, I don't think, but if I zoom in a bit, it's right in the centre of the frame. You can just see that it's there. I'll move out of the light. I'll point to it using the dipstick just because I can. Right down there, you can just see it, right? I'm just touching it with the dipstick. That's got an O-ring on the end of it too, and that requires all this stuff to be pulled off, the alternator and tensioner pulley bracket assembly. And if you're going to start doing all this, and like the front crank seal, if you're going to do a crank seal, you might as well throw out the crank angle sensor, because they pack up on every car eventually, right? These are particularly prone to doing them, but this sensor's original and the car's like nearly 20 years old, so some of them are good, some of them are bad. It's just like the DFI modules in these. You know, they're mounted on the head, which is probably the worst place you could mount it, because semiconductors don't like vibration and heat, right? So there's not really any way of relocating the coil packs easily, and you'd end up with very long spark leads, which is not exactly desirable. But anyhow, this is probably going too far, this rambling update, but you know, by the time you replace every single part of the cooling system, which you're going to need to do on an old car, like, it's all very well to say, oh, you know, the water pump's quiet, but look, the pump's quiet for 5 minutes, and then they start leaking, and then the bearings go. This has had a pump on it, I don't know, 4 years ago. It's a $29 water pump, but it's fine, nothing wrong with it. Even something right down to all these idler tensioner pulleys, and something's wrong here, I don't know what, but you can see this belt starting to walk across closer to the edge of this pulley, and I'm not sure why. I mean, maybe the bearings in this are a bit shagged, but maybe the water pump bearings are a bit loose. Well, they definitely have clearance. although they do have clearance from standard, so be careful, because a brand new water pump does have some slack in the bearings. But yeah, one of these pulleys has got something wrong with it, or something's out of alignment. Yeah, but anyway, I've replaced all of them already over the years, and it's just a huge pain, because if you don't replace them, you get an old car, the engine's dirty and greasy. The first thing everyone wants to do is to take it to a car wash, blast all the grease away, and then the seals on these bearings, they fail, and then water gets in, and then basically every single one of them is going to need replacing, because then it'll scream every time you start it up. So you end up replacing the idler pulleys, the belts, the crank angle sensor, and like, okay, you have to draw a line somewhere with any car, and these are enthusiast vehicles at this stage. I mean, they're cheap transport if you don't mind topping up oil and checking coolant daily. Like, if you have one of these cars, you should be opening the bonnet so often you have a spare bonnet release cable in case one breaks. Like, that's how often this bonnet goes up, because this engine does leak coolant. It does leak things like oil. So you need to know this crap. You can't take it for granted with a car that's more than 10 years old that it doesn't leak brake fluid and oil and power steering fluid and stuff. So you need to make sure that you're keeping up to date with the checks. If I randomly said to you, is your oil above the ad mark, you should be able to answer. That's how often you should have your bonnet up on your car. A new car or one that's less than 10 years old, it doesn't matter, because they don't leak. Really, like, they're not just going to pour out oil or coolant or whatever. But old cars, they do leak, and they need every seal, gasket and things like that to be changed to stop them leaking. And if you haven't done that already, that's something you're going to need to either do or just get a newer car. So the thing is, I don't want to put a car on the road and have the thing just an unreliable pest. I mean, I don't want to have to pull the bonnet up every day. I want to check oil weekly and know that if I don't check it every day, there's going to be enough in there. And the only way to achieve that is to rebuild the engine. And if you're going to pull an engine out and take it right apart, except the crank and pistons and bearings out, you might as well even replace the pistons, piston rings and bearings and actually have it rebored, because what you're going to spend is going to save money in the long run. And if the car's half decent like this is, I don't see a harm in doing it. Alternatively, you could try and fit, if it's like a VS Commodore, a later model engine, because they use basically the same engine. Don't ask me if there are any differences, I don't know. I know there are differences, but how relevant they are or easy they are to modify to fit, I don't know. But yeah, well, that's the update and the reason why I'm actually rebuilding this engine, not just doing a head gasket or whatever, because whatever I don't do, I'll end up doing or putting up with.